Hi, and welcome to the Agile Couple Podcast. I'm Leeanne McManus, and I'm excited to kick off our very first series called The Language of Clarity. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, let him introduce himself and tell you about our topic.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Kevin McManus, and today's episode is called Nothing to Hide, Practicing Radical Transparency Without the Fallout.
I think what we're going to do is we're just going to ask each other some questions. We've got different experiences, and it's kind of a fun topic, and I think most of you in the audience will relate to these. So to kick it off, Kevin, because I think you've worked lots of different places, mostly in technical positions, but different types of organizations, right? From government agencies to big private business to small private business. When you've been part of an organization, whether you're new to the organization or been there a while, can you tell us what you think transparency looks like? How would somebody recognize if that organization is operating with transparency?
Yeah. So I think the transparency is such a critical factor for successful and efficient organizations. If you think about the empirical process, transparency is that first pillar, right? Transparency, it basically is establishing visibility into the work and everything that needs to be done. And then you have the ability to inspect and adapt based off of that iterative nature. And it's just this cycle. But at the core of that empirical process is establishing transparency, which is making sure that everybody understands what the objective is and make sure that everybody understands what role they're playing, what their responsibilities are, what their deliverables are in order to deliver for the organization. So transparency really comes down to what we've commonly referred to as open kimono, which is that information is so readily available that you don't have to question, where exactly you get that information from. It's part of the culture that you just have that level of transparency, that level of honesty and candor to make sure that everybody is able to operate with the full complement of information. And I think one of the things that is probably easier to identify is when that transparency isn't in place. And there's some pain points that I'm sure our audience is probably going to be familiar with. And I think it'd be important to kind of go through those at this point and kind of identify what are some of those symptoms, what are some of those pain points that organizations deal with. So Leeanne, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Well, there's many, and I think literally anybody who's worked in any type of company has seen this. So a few that jump out to me, we've got a kind of a list of them, but there's probably more than what's on our list. But the first one on our list says delayed decision-making. And this is particularly painful for me because I am a go get it done type of person. And when you can't have decisions made, it's usually because it's coming from some siloed decision maker or some siloed department or something like that, right? And they're either not sharing information, don't have enough information to get the job done or make a decision or whatever the problem is, but ultimately it's stopping work from getting done, which is super frustrating. A lot of times, the siloing I just said, so siloing effect we have on here, I think that's the one that is, for me, like the giant target. That's one I can tell because a person or group of people or a department or maybe even the whole culture is set up where they have intentionally or unintentionally set up these silos. So sometimes it's just, that's the way the culture is whether you like it or not, this is the way the rules are, right? That's not going to be a very successful organization and provide a happy work environment for people. But the siloing effect sometimes is, I want to build my fiefdom, and so this is how I manage that. Yep. Sometimes it's a lack of maybe not being qualified to do whatever needs to happen. And so it's controlling the message and controlling that information. There's a lot, those are all kind of negative things. That's what I've personally seen that siloing comes out of as a byproduct of those kind of things. We'll talk about some ways that you can kind of change it, but when you change it, the siloing becomes very obvious. It's kind of like a neon sign. Isolationism is another thing. So people start to isolate. They isolate themselves. They isolate the group. They isolate the decision. They isolate the information. Like that's part of in alignment with siloing, I think. Assumptions is another one we have on here. So if you don't know the information, you automatically make assumptions, good or bad, right? And that's generally, you're not all going for the same common goal when that happens, because you have to come up with information. You assume somebody isn't doing something, whatever the assumptions are, it's not going to be in alignment with somebody else because you're making an assumption.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that I've often coached teams on is if you find yourself making assumptions, that's a red flag
Right.
that you're missing information.
Right.
So as soon as you start making those assumptions, that should be your trigger that I need to seek out whoever has that information and be able to, close that knowledge gap so that we're making decisions, on
data.
good information,
Yeah.
the data, exactly.
Yeah. A couple others, which I think literally anybody that I've worked with, and even working on nonprofits, right? We're on a board for our son's rugby team. And you see some of this here with the different groups. It's people get disengaged, they get overwhelmed, they get frustrated. So when you start to see disengagement, there's probably another red flag, right? So you can picture just throwing some flags up going, wait, this could be a source of disengagement when people are feeling frustrated because they don't have access to the information or they don't know what's going on or whatever it is. Two more kind of big ones. So obviously a lack of trust. If you're somebody who's suffering from the other side of, like, you're asking for transparency, you're asking for access and you don't get it, or you're blocked, or, whoever it is that's the holder of the key of information is not letting you access that information, it definitely causes a trust issue for you moving forward. And the trust thing is a hard thing to earn back, and it's a hard thing to forget about in future situations. And then the last one is surrendering. So it's like, whether you call it, I'm going to wave the white flag of surrender or not, that's in alignment really with disengagement. I don't think we want people surrendering because they don't have access to transparency. I think that's not a positive culture, result. So What do you think about that?
No, I totally agree. And if you look at the lack of trust, the surrendering, the disengagement, all of those things are characteristics that leaders have to be cognizant of. They need to be able to recognize that, because what that's doing is that is truly just a symptom, but that root cause, based on our experience, has really been that lack of transparency. If they don't understand where they're going, why they're going, and are involved, on a regular basis in getting that information, then that surrender is a big, that is a big concern that comes up, where people are just no longer going to be effective because they've stopped caring.
Yep. Yeah. So apathy. It's just, that's not what you want as a leader, for sure. Okay. So now switching gears from talking about the pain points, let's talk about what transparency does look like. And in this instance, we're talking about radical transparency, right? So if you would to give some guidance on how you would recognize a culture is working within that transparency mode and has radical transparency, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think when you hear the phrase radical transparency, what pops into my mind is there is absolutely nothing that is hidden. All the information's available, whether it be through the systems, but more importantly, it should be from the culture and from the leadership and kind of setting that tone. And when I talk about leadership, that doesn't necessarily mean your management or your executive. Leadership is what each person brings to the table. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you have leaders, that are amongst your teams. And I think those are the individuals that you want to be able to raise up as the example and say, this is where we need to go, right? And if you talk about the radical transparency, just like with any change, you talk about change management or change in the process, it's an evolutionary process. You're not going to go from everything being hidden to immediately radical transparency, right? And I think it's important for organizations to understand that this is a journey. It's not going to be, like in Star Trek, where it's like, beam me up, Scotty, and you go from point A to point B, from absolute, obscurity to absolute, transparency, especially radical transparency. So I think that's one of the things that organizations need to be cognizant of is you're making an investment for the long-term success and for the long-term health. And we know that via that transparency, going back to that empirical process, the ability to evaluate and see the work that needs to be done and then inspect and adapt based on changing requirements. And especially being in a technical field for really all my career, software development, that's an evolutionary process. You don't have all the answers up front.
Right.
So quit putting yourself in a position where you expect to have pristine requirements. That doesn't happen.
No.
It never does happen. And I think the way that you address that, though, is that you adopt a mindset and you build within your culture that importance of, we're not going to be hiding information. We're going to be sharing that information so that everybody has the ability to contribute and to be able to have a say in the direction and how things go about getting done, how that work is being done.
Yeah. And well, if I can add to that too, I've seen certain leadership. So that is that word. It's like, it's not always top down, as you said, but there are significant people of influence in a company that when they live and breathe it, it's authentic. Number one, it's not some fake thing that they just say, we're going to be transparent, but there's no action tied to it. But the people some people just have a mode of operation that are that way. I personally am that way. And sometimes I'm like, oh, I was recently actually just told, maybe you should, can you recall that message you sent and change it because maybe we don't want all that feedback? That's already out. So no, but I can go back and say we're okay right now. But I would rather err on the side of, hey, everybody, here's the stuff to go look at. Here's what it is, than to not include people in it. But yeah, it's interesting, the whole influence and if you live and breathe transparency because you believe it, because you seek it out, you understand the benefits of it when everybody's on the same page. You may not all be in agreement, but when you understand what the edict is or what the goal is or whatever that is, and we're all working towards the same goal, you may not be in alignment, but you're definitely a lot happier that you understand why or where we're going, which is part of that change management thing you talked about as well.
Yeah. And I think you hit on a couple of key points there as well, because when you talk about that transparency, what you're asking people to do is push out of their comfort zones. And that whole trust, it's like if you're asking people to be transparent, but you in a leadership position are acting contrary to that.
Right.
And when people are transparent and they think that they're in a position where you're willing to accept their feedback, but as soon as they give you their honest feedback, you smack them down,
Right.
you've just destroyed
It's the trust
any
thing.
of that initiative. Yeah, it's absolutely the trust aspect of it. And I think once again, it's a progression, right? And you need to be able to, you don't go from 0 to running a marathon overnight. You need to be able to train. You need to be able to condition. You need to be able to model that behavior. And once again, identify some of those ambassadors or those champions within your organization. I hate those words sometimes, but you need to find those people that that they're modeling that behavior that you want others, to be able to model and follow suit.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing is when you're asking people to communicate openly and have that transparency, you need to be in a position and be able to receive that in a way that is constructive. And that also means that for those that are operating in the transparency, that doesn't mean, go out and just say everything that's on your mind.
Right. There's context that needs to be tied to it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was even thinking over the years, my background forever ago was HR, right? And it was always like, well, let's do some surveys and ask them for some honest feedback. Except we don't really want honest feedback.
Right.
We want to know who's saying something. Well, they already know that.
Yeah.
So your intent is already there. That's not transparency. That's not what we're talking about, right? So, and it's we're talking about building a culture of it. So if you're leading a team or you're co-partnering as a team and you guys want to change how your team is going to operate, it doesn't have to be the whole company. Maybe the company doesn't operate that way, but you can decide you're going to work different. And we're going to try something else, which is really the agile teams that we know that are successful. It's because they truly live and breathe this transparency way, right? And it's the radical transparency is you get to the point where it is so commonplace that everything is there and there's no, maybe I have to tell you that your baby's ugly, whatever you just made. I can still do that in a constructive way, but I'm definitely going to tell you.
Right.
Like something about what you just made is not going to work. And if I feel like I can't do that because I'm going to get beat down or whatever, that's not radical transparency.
Right. Well, it goes back to your example where it's like you were asked, well, maybe you could recall that message. that's not practicing that transparency.
Right.
Because oftentimes the things that are the hardest issues to deal with are the ones that nobody is willing to talk about.
Right. Yes.
So if you immediately stifle that and say, you need to, address that. No, get the information out there. And then as professionals, we all have to have that level of intellectual humility to be able to recognize that it's more important for that message to be delivered than necessarily the messenger or the tone or the
Right.
approach. You're not we're not perfect human beings, and you need to be able to get the information out there and start practicing working with other people and building that culture
Yeah.
and building that environment where you have that ability to be honest, to have that level of candor, to be able to have that integrity that when you say you want honest feedback, you're getting honest feedback.
Well, can I ask you this? Because when you hear transparency, I mean, we automatically went to like access to information, right? When I think transparency, for me, it's much bigger than just I want to know what the decision made or whatever. I want to have access to the same repos. I want to have access to the same files. I want to have access to, like, it's things, it's people, it's places, it's all of the things. And that's when we say radical transparency, it's not just, hey, here's this bit of information about this is what we're going to do. It's much bigger than that. So when you've got this exclusive group of people who have access to some SharePoint site or something, but you're assuming nobody else needs it. And maybe there is like reasons why you don't want everybody to have access to information, but you want to start kind of having that lens that you look at of like, do we care if other people see this? And maybe this is helpful to another group that they could see this information, that sort of thing. To me, is there anything else when you think of transparency that you would include?
Yeah, I think one of the traps, and I fall into this, frequently, is knowledge bias.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And that knowledge bias is I'm assuming that because I've been around the conversations or I've been around the information, what's in my head, everybody else can read my mind.
Right.
And that's where you have to change that behavior, and you need to be very deliberate about checking yourself and that knowledge bias and making sure that the people that you're talking to understand what's in your head. And the only way that you do that is through verbalizing it and communicating it. And I think knowledge bias is one of those things that is a major inhibitor to transparency, and we all do it.
And it's not even a negative driven thing.
No,
it's literally something that's part of your process. So, because actually we're working on a project where a couple of people have been working on this thing for literally months, like 6 months, and then they had to have some other people go through it, and all of that knowledge bias, because they've been living and breathing it for 6 months. They completely forgot that somebody new would not know all of those things. I think that happens all the time.
it does.
Yeah,
It
that's a
absolutely does.
huge one, actually.
Yep.
So let me switch and ask you a couple things about some of the pain points we talked about. So what does siloing look like to you?
Yeah, so siloing, I've seen a lot of different examples of this, and it really is a matter of it's an anti-pattern to that transparency. The siloing is you've got either individuals or groups that, once again, whether it is intentional or unintentional, they basically have a group of people that are in the know. And on the extreme cases, you have individuals that are like, you can't talk to such and such. I had one situation where I worked with a group, and it was so bad at one point, as far as that lack of transparency and the control, that I had business analysts that were coming to me and they're like, hey, I sit across the hall. It's not even a hall. It's like, in a cubicle, but I don't know if I can talk to them. I'm like, this is nuts.
Yes.
This is crazy. But I think those siloing effects, it's really a matter of taking bad telephone game to an extreme, which is, you have a piece of information that flows through, and the more nodes in the communication, right, that happen, it's like the more diluted the message becomes.
Translation and
Right. So,
and intent behind that in the translation. Like, there's a lot of things.
Yeah, the intent, everything else, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I had another story of yours that came to mind, but we'll save that for a different podcast, but we'll come back to that. What do you think, how how does all of this lack of transparency cause a lack of trust? Like, how does it show up just in a simple way?
I think the biggest thing is if you're not open and honest with your team, they pick up on it because they're hearing information from other people, right? And they're like, why am I not hearing that from my manager? Why am I not hearing that from my team lead? And the trust aspect of it, is really affected. And I think that's, as an example, one of the things that I've learned over my career is, once again, I kind of have to check myself with that knowledge bias. So the way that I address it is I make sure that on my teams, I've got the one-on-ones that occur frequently. I make sure that there is a team meeting as well where everybody's hearing the same thing, especially if it's important and it's affecting everybody. Rather than having that in a one-on-one, it's like bring them all together and say, this is what's affecting, our project at this moment in time, or these are the priorities, or here's a change that's coming, so that everybody has the opportunity to both hear and also ask questions and hear those answers at the same time as well.
I think that's a huge thing. So, a lot of companies do, we're going to have an all staff or whatever. There is a benefit to that everybody's hearing the same message. The problem with that usually is timing.
Yes.
Right? It's usually way too late.
Right.
And people talk. It doesn't matter what level you are. People talk in all the different communities that are in a company.
And that's a great point because, yes, people talk, right? I worked at a company where I intentionally, within my weekly staff meeting, I put a section in there on grapevine. It's like, okay, what's floating around the grapevine? I mean, I'm hearing it.
Because that is transparency. You're just saying, I know it's happening.
Yeah, so acknowledge what it is,
Yeah.
right? But in doing so, what I was also working towards is establishing a higher degree of trust, which is I'm not going to put those concerns aside. What I'm hearing in the grapevine, it's like, let's get them out there and give them the light of day and let's talk about it because once again, if you don't have the full picture, if you don't have all the information, that's where the assumptions come
I was just
in.
going to say that. So, because you can also shut it down and go, that's 100% not true. And here's what the truth is. So the assumptions you just made are that came from telephone game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you have to be very consistent, especially in a leadership position. You have to exercise that level of integrity so that it's not just a one-time thing. Because that trust it takes a long time to earn and it can be lost very quickly.
Yeah. It's harder to gain back, actually.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, that consistency in the messaging and that consistency in just having that openness and putting yourself out there, it doesn't matter what role you're in, whether you're in leadership or, an individual contributor, is you need to be able to have that courage to be able to have that level of vulnerability. And be able to, both give and take that feedback to establish that culture of transparency.
Yeah. Well, and if you're, let's say you're new to an organization that's been established and people have been there for a long time, you are not going to change that culture overnight.
No.
So all you can do is change how you work. And if you're in a leadership position or somebody who has some influence, you can slowly change it. But that does feed a fire really quick. When people do see that you're like, oh, well, we don't have that problem on this team because this is what we do.
Right.
And guess what? We're getting more work done because we're not dealing with those things. That's where it starts to catch on in an organization.
Yep.
But you kind of need to be realistic about it. And I have been definitely personally where people don't like it. People that are at the same level as you or above you may not like that you're doing it because it goes against whatever their fears are or whatever their mode of operation. So you just have to know that going into you're going to take arrows. But when you have a team of people or you have a very successful project or things that are happening that are positive out of it, it starts, you'll be like, I'll take the arrows again. I will do that again. And it starts to have a positive impact. So, yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
So what are some of the techniques to start building transparency? So specifically, like what would you do if you had a team or you were a leader? What would be some of the things you would say for our audience that they might be able to do to start to implement this?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is you need to be able to have an understanding of, one, having self-awareness of yourself, and then also having an understanding of who are the people that you're working with. So one of the things, for example, that we do, here at the Agile Couple and IQ Solutions and our other businesses, is we put a lot of emphasis on assessments, and we've invested, ourselves in going through and having a better understanding of being able to deliver those. So the TTI assessments, those are ones that when you talk about DISC, you and I had that epiphany a decade ago.
Yeah.
As far as how I would respond to certain things, and through that assessment, we actually had some clarity that came about, and it was a very principled type of position that I was taking. It wasn't a matter of I was trying to be stubborn for stubborn's sake, but that assessment helped kind of tease that out, and our relationship, improved because of that.
You know what about that? So it is a funny story, but I remember at the time, because I had asked him about making a decision on something. Couldn't tell you what it was now, but he was just like an absolute no. And I went back to my office and I was like, what? Okay, wait, we just did these assessments, and I pulled it up and I'm like, oh, it actually wasn't your DISC. It was your driving forces or your motivator. And he is very principle driven. So that's it. And those things are what you make decisions on without even consciously thinking about it. So I went back in and I asked you, I'm like, okay, did you say no because XYZ, or did you say no because you principally disagree? And you was like, I principally disagree. And I went, oh, that's your motivator. Like I knew what it was. But I remember feeling kind of angsty with you at the moment. And I was like, I felt like it's a lack of transparency and you're not communicating, and just like all those things. So I made assumptions about why you answered that way or whatever with the lack of understanding. And you also the same thing. So the assessments do help, right?
They really do.
It's not just definitely about yourself, because that's how you relate to everything else. Because you're like, oh, well, yeah, I do that. I do communicate that way, or I don't do that. But more so is, how do you figure out when you know what somebody else, what their behavior styles is, or if you know what they're motivated by, or what and we just went through Working Genius. If you understand what their natural given joy-filling geniuses are versus what their frustrations are, that gives me information to be able to go, oh, okay, so I am being judgmental based on what I know and how I relate to the world, instead of now I have this information, I can come back to you and maybe I need to ask it a different way.
Right.
I need to tell you I need transparency a different way, what that means to me. So the vocabulary matters.
Yeah,
right?
It does. And I think the other thing, and I've been in this industry long enough, I'm going on like 35 years in tech. So I've seen the evolution, I've seen the cycles, the up and downs, centralized versus decentralized, and all that kind of stuff, right? And I think one of the things that is really important is you have to be able to recognize that when you're dealing with people, you're dealing with that individual, right? And they've got their own opinions, they've got their own experience, they have their own ego, trauma, right? There's all these things that are contributing to it. And the better positioned you are and they are to be able to have a deeper understanding of just the superficial, go into work, and spend 8 hours. If you truly have an understanding and use some of these assessments that provide, the research and the scientific backing to really dig into, this is how I like to be communicated with, or based on my style. I don't like to have the long conversation. Just give me the highlights.
Give me the bullet points.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what that does, and as trainers as well, we've been in front of classrooms, and you may have 20 people in that room, but every one of those people is learning differently, and they're on a different spectrum, as far as some people may be brand new to it and you're going to spend a little bit more time with them. But it's incumbent upon us as those trainers and those facilitators to adapt the message to what their needs are.
Yeah.
As opposed to, certain environments, it's like, here, I'm going to stand up in front of everybody, and you 200 need to adapt to what I'm telling you. That does not work, right?
Well, it's not successful.
It's not.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. I think just maybe one more kind of question here is, not a question actually. So it's a thought that I have noted down. So the assessments is a huge thing. Another thing, and you actually already mentioned this, and you said I don't like using these words, but finding who you want to model the behavior after. So whether you're calling them, we used to say evangelists, or you're calling them champions, or you're calling them ambassadors, whatever the word is, But those who everybody knows, and it doesn't matter what level they are, those that already model that, which literally it's probably natural for them,
Right.
start to talk to them, start to find out why they work that way, or ask them questions about, wait, so when you're in a project and you're working on X, how do you share this information? Or how do you decide what to share? Or how early do you do this? And those sort of things. And you might be really mystified by how simple it is. And because you also don't have to keep track of stuff when you're just transparent. That's
Right.
the other thing, is that it's very easy because I'm not hiding. I'm not playing a game. There's not anything. Now, in leadership positions, like I've been in HR, or we're leaders of a company or multiple companies, I can't tell everybody everything all at the same time, but I'm not going to fib, or I might give them a heads up and say, hey, it looks like there might be something coming. I'm just putting it on your radar. No decisions made, just so that you know, because with change management, the earlier that somebody learns about something and they have more time to kind of process what's happening and what's changing, the better it's going to be, right, down the road. And even as parents, bad information does not get better over time.
Right.
Like the sooner that I get the bad news, the better I can help make a change or can adapt to it or whatever those things are. So it's really the same in an organization. So I would say find those people to model, come up with whatever that model looks like, and start to build around that. And know that you're going to iterate on it over and over and over.
Yeah. And I think one of the terms that you had used earlier, and I think is really important, is the authenticity. And I think that's one of the things that actually helps with regard to the building of trust, right? People, you know, when you're dealing with somebody that is being honest and they have that level of authenticity. And I think the thing that you can recognize is it doesn't matter what audience or what group that they're talking to, there's a consistency there.
Right.
As opposed to, we've all seen people that, depending upon who's around.
Like, how did you get that? That's not what they said to me just yesterday or
Right.
whatever.
And how they behave is going to be different based on who that audience is. That authenticity, you know, that measure goes out the window, the trust goes down. You need to have that consistency to be able to help one establish that example and to be able to model that behavior. And I think that is such a powerful aspect and a powerful word, is just being authentic with your people.
The other thing that I was thinking, because you know we work on agile teams and agile in general, we've had like, you put up your Scrum values, you put up these things, you put up your goals, you put up these whatever is visually there. If you're working, you know, with disparate teams, and so maybe you have it on Teams or and wherever your shared location is, that is also helpful. The warning I would give for that is, don't just do the work of like, we're going to put this up and say we're going to be transparent, we're going to have radical transparency, but there's no rubber meets the road, right? So it's all for naught. And then it breaks down trust again if you don't have a plan and you don't do it. But I do think that access and seeing those things, like this is a shared value, this is what we agreed, we had a team agreement, and this is what we're going to try and do. Let's put that up. Let's make sure it's visible and everybody sees it. And we start off our meetings this way or whatever. That's great. But don't just do the words and not the follow through. That would be a caveat, I would say.
And I think as far as, you know, saying, hey, we're going to exercise radical transparency or we're going to establish transparency, I think you need to also be able to quantify that and be able to say, this is what we mean by transparency.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
These are the things that we're trying to address. We don't want to take months to make a decision because in the market that we're in, we have to be making decisions daily or weekly.
And we're going to make mistakes. And that's part of the transparency.
Absolutely. But that mistake, that's part of the growth.
Right.
One of my favorite sayings, through pain comes growth.
Yeah.
And this is a very uncomfortable thing for people to face because you're pushing them out of those comfort zones. The natural tendency for people is to not share the information. And usually there's some trauma, there's some previous experience that caused them, you know, to operate like that.
Yeah. There's usually historical debt, like from a cultural perspective. Something's already happened and I spoke up once and I will never do that again.
Yeah. Or I saw somebody else get their, you know, get their head
Yeah.
knocked and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah.
Right. That's that surrendering.
But I can tell you, I'm like working in an organization or in organizations and on teams that have transparency, it's freeing.
Right.
Right. And so it's very easy to go. And most of the time, it's a lack of people they're busy and they're doing a bunch of things. And when you say, hey, I don't have that thing, or I'm not included on the email or whatever it is, oops. Okay, can we, because we have a business partner, we're like that, right? And we're like, hey, we're not on that email again. So you're talking about it and you're sharing, you're being transparent, but we didn't get it. We don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry. I'll try and make sure I include you. It's just bringing it up and being able to build stuff around it and giving people grace for making mistakes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
I think that's good. So this is the first series that we, or excuse me, the first episode we have in our series. Our next episode is really about building a common language for clarity and connection. So it's the words we live and work by. More of this same series, and the series is called The Language of Clarity, because we think understanding language matters, words matter, having a domain understanding about things, and having where it means the same thing. So when you said, what does transparency mean on this team or in this company or whatever, you got to set those domain understandings. So we're excited. Thank you for joining us for our podcast. Follow all the socials and let us know if you've got questions or anything that you'd love us to talk about. Yeah.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thanks
Have a great
all.
day.
Take care.
Bye.